Mr. President, I'd like to commend the senator from New Hampshire for her stirring remarks on the terrorist attack in Benghazi and urge that we pay heed to the words she just said. It is striking that the senator from New Hampshire has said more about that terrorist attack than our commander-in-chief has ever said. Mr. President, we're at a time where Tolkien's classic The Hobbit is one of the best-selling, most popular movies in the country. The Hobbit is a fantasy story. And in Washington, we were visited with fantasy last week in the President's State of the Union address. I'd like to talk today about the contrast concerning foreign policy between the fantasy that was presented to the American people and the cold, hard realities of the dangerous world in which we live, which is only getting more and more dangerous. In his State of the Union address last week, President Obama gave some revealing clues as to how he believes the United States should interact with the rest of the world. On the whole, his remarks encouraged Americans not to worry too much about international challenges, as he suggested the situations in Syria and Iran are being deftly managed by American diplomats, that Al-Qaeda is now a regional nuisance that can be outsourced to surrogates, that our relationship with Israel is defined by the Palestinian peace process, which will also be resolved in short order through American diplomacy, that our interest in Ukraine is to express support for the abstract principle that all people should peacefully participate in their own governments. In this rosy scenario, difficult challenges such as the deadly terrorist attacks on Benghazi on September 11th, 2012, or the long and painful ordeal of Pastor Saeed Abedini in an Iranian prison simply do not exist. I wish we all lived in the utopian world that President Obama painted last week. But in just a week, picking up the newspaper, numerous news reports have come out to suggest that that picture belongs far more in the world of fantasy than reality. In the interest of being honest with the American people, which I wish our commander-in-chief had done, I would like to contrast reality with what we were told last week. On Syria, in the State of the Union, the President claimed, quote, American diplomacy, backed by the threat of force, is why Syria's chemical weapons are being eliminated. And we will continue to work with the international community to usher in the future the Syrian people deserve, a future free of dictatorship, terror, and fear. Truly a rosy scenario. And yet, what is the reality? On Sunday, just 4 days after the President delivered the State of the Union address, Secretary of State John Kerry reportedly told a congressional delegation that the administration's Syria policy is on the brink of collapse. Syria's chemical weapons are purportedly being destroyed through the intervention of Vladimir Putin in what was a major diplomatic victory for the Russian strongman. But we have learned in recent days that this process has not proceeded as promised. The Syrians have ignored their deadlines, and only 4% of the stockpiles have been eliminated, undoubtedly because Assad knows that there is no compelling reason for him to comply. As for what the Syrian people deserve, after 3 years of rudderless U.S. policy, over 130,000 are dead. Millions are refugees displaced across the region. And the oldest Christian communities on the planet are threatened with extinction. Assad is entrenched, and Al-Qaeda is in control of the opposition. Sadly, as a result of the President's mismanagement, today we have no good options in Syria. And yet not a word of that made it into his State of the Union address. On Iran, the President claimed, quote, "It is American diplomacy, backed by pressure, that has halted the progress of Iran's nuclear program. The reality, Mr. President, is quite different. No enriched uranium has been destroyed, not a pound, and no centrifuges have been dismantled. The Iranians quickly refuted the president's claim in the State of the Union, announcing quite publicly that they have not halted their progress in the slightest. America's closest ally in the region, the nation of Israel, has called this a, quote, very, very bad deal. Indeed, Prime Minister Netanyahu has referred to it as an historic mistake. And yet the president proceeds on, and the United States Senate refuses even to allow a vote on reimposing sanctions to prevent Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons capability. There has been no renunciation of Iran's state sponsorship of terrorism that killed Americans in Lebanon, in Saudi Arabia, in Afghanistan, in Iraq. And the mullahs have gone on a hanging spree, executing some 40 people in the first 2 weeks of January alone. Meanwhile, billions of dollars are flowing into the country, both through relaxed sanctions and Iran's reemergence as a legitimate business partner because of this administration's misguided deal. Indeed, Iranian President Rouhani might almost be forgiven for publicly gloating that, quote, the Geneva deal means the surrender of the big powers in front of the great nation of Iran. Mr. President, I wish he were not speaking the truth. But that reality did not emerge on the House floor last week. On the House floor, the president claimed, quote, if John F. Kennedy and Ronald Reagan could negotiate with the Soviet Union, then surely a strong and confident America can negotiate with less powerful adversaries today. The reality is that the claim that we are negotiating with Iran from a position of strength and confidence is a blinkered view of reality, because it isn't even clear our president is negotiating towards actual victory. Capitulation is not victory. President Obama announced in the State of the Union that in order to keep negotiations going, he would veto any additional sanctions Congress might pass to pressure Iran to actually stop pursuing nuclear weapons. A position that is supported not only by his current administration, but expressly by his former Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton. Iranian Foreign Minister Javad Zarif has good reason to announce publicly he has no, quote, fear of Congress. When Ronald Reagan negotiated with the Soviets, he did it from a clear strategic perspective of we win, they lose, standing for U.S. national interest. He was facing an existential threat that he defined as an evil empire. There was no danger of misunderstanding what the goal was or who was going to be doing the surrendering. And as a result of his leadership, the Cold War was won without firing a shot. Today, Mr. President, on Iran, we are tragically repeating the mistakes of the past, in particular, the mistakes of the Clinton administration in relaxing sanctions on North Korea for the same empty promises that they would cease developing nuclear weapons, only to have North Korea use the billions of dollars we sent to them or allowed to go to them to develop nuclear weapons. The difference is the North Korean leader is motivated by staying in power, which means some form of rational deterrence is hopefully possible. In Iran, the supreme leader has made clear his desire to destroy the nation of Israel, and as a result of the billions of dollars going to Iran right now, the risk is unacceptably high that we discover the same thing that happened in North Korea happened in Iran, except that we discover it because Iran, in pursuit of jihad, detonates a nuclear device over Tel Aviv or New York or Los Angeles. Not a word of that was acknowledged in the president's speech. On Al-Qaeda, President Obama claimed, quote, "We have put Al-Qaeda's core leadership on a path to defeat. The threat has evolved as Al-Qaeda affiliates and other extremists take root in different parts of the world. In Yemen, Somalia, Iraq, and Mali, we have to keep working with partners to disrupt and disable those networks." The reality, Mr. President, whatever path Al-Qaeda is on, it does not currently appear to be towards defeat. The recent assertion by a State Department spokeswoman that Ayman al-Zawahiri is the only core Al-Qaeda member left, and thus the threat has been decimated by the president, is demonstrably false. For starters, Zawahiri is no mere abstract threat. He explicitly called for attacks on the United States on September 10th, 2012, the day before the terrorist attack that claimed the lives of 4 Americans in Benghazi, including the first U.S. ambassador killed on duty since 1979. And Zawahiri is actively involved in directing Al-Qaeda groups that are active in Syria. But core or non-core, whatever that means, the reality is that Al-Qaeda has been at war with the United States for more than 2 decades. And the attacks of September 11th, 2001 are only the most spectacular of a series of attacks and attempted attacks launched at us. Trying to parse this threat to make it seem less deadly, to make it seem like less of a threat to Americans, will not make it so. We need to confront what attacked us in 2001. You cannot defeat radical Islamic terrorism when the president seems unwilling to utter the words radical Islamic terrorism. And indeed, the recent Senate Select Committee on Intelligence documented that what attacked us in Libya in 2012 is the very same thing that attacked us on September 11th, 2001. We should not aim simply to disrupt or to disable Al-Qaeda terrorists. We should aim to defeat them. On Israel, Mr. President, the State of the Union, the President had one mention of Israel in that speech. He said, quote, "American diplomacy is supporting Israelis and Palestinians as they engage in difficult but necessary talks to end the conflict there, to achieve dignity and an independent state for Palestinians, and a lasting peace and security for the State of Israel, a Jewish state that knows America will always be at their side." The reality, Mr. President, is sadly much different. Over the weekend, we saw a diplomatic spat play out in the press over allegations that Secretary of State Kerry is actively working behind the scenes to encourage European countries to threaten Israel with boycotts if the Israelis don't agree to whatever framework Mr. Kerry will propose in 2 weeks. Rather than threats from the U.S. Secretary of State, and rather than tweets from National Security Advisor Susan Rice criticizing Israel, instead, the United States should stand unequivocally with our friend and ally, the nation of Israel. We should reaffirm Israel's unique status as a strong democratic ally in the Middle East, a uniquely Jewish state, and that the United States appreciates the excruciatingly difficult security situation in which Israel finds itself with the threat of a nuclear Iran, and that the United States will vigorously defend Israel from attacks, from international institutions, from legal onslaughts, and from attempts to undermine Israel's economy through punitive boycotts. and that the United States is unshakably committed to preserving Israel's security regardless of the status of the peace process. Mr. President, I would commend to you the recent remarks Canadian Prime Minister Stephen Harper gave in Israel. Those are the remarks of an ally standing strong with Israel and appreciating the incredible value that Israel provides to our national security and to peace in the world. I wish that our president could speak with a fraction of the clarity and solidarity with Israel that the Canadian Prime Minister recently provided. On Ukraine, the president claimed, quote, "In Ukraine, we stand for the principle that all people have a right to express themselves freely and peacefully and to have a say in their country's future." The reality, Mr. President, is the day after the State of the Union, Ukraine's former president said that the country teeters on the brink of civil war. Protesters have been brutally tortured and murdered. Indeed, one opposition leader described how he was recently crucified. The Ukrainian people's constitutional rights have been trampled. This former Soviet republic has been wrenched away from a proposed trade agreement with the EU and a path towards NATO membership, and instead thrust back into Russia's sphere of influence by a corrupt and autocratic leader, depriving the United States of an important economic and security partner. Mr. President, we need to tell this story. We need to look for concrete actions we can take right now to demonstrate real support for the opposition, to demonstrate real support that Ukraine is welcomed by the West, and that we will not accede to Putin's efforts to reassemble the old Soviet Union and place Ukraine under its domination. We can start by immediately offering a free trade agreement to Ukraine and partnerships to help them build natural gas infrastructure so that they need not remain dependent upon Russia, which uses natural gas to blackmail them. And we could immediately release exports of liquid natural gas from the United States in conjunction with helping with that infrastructure. Surely the people gathering in the frozen snow of Maiden Square, crying out for the freedom of the West, deserve more from the leader of the free world than mere blandishments about abstract universal rights. If you're standing in the frozen streets of Kiev, being beaten, bleeding, naked as one opposition leader was, and yet standing proud for freedom, empty generalities from the president do you very little good. On Benghazi, the president claimed nothing. We all remember last fall during the debates in the presidential election, just over a year ago, when the president emphatically stated no one cared more about the terrorist attack that happened in Benghazi than he did. And yet in the year and a half that has followed, the word Benghazi seems never to leave his lips. The reality is we have 4 Americans murdered in a preventable attack. And that's what the Senate Intelligence Committee concluded in a bipartisan manner, that this was preventable by Al-Qaeda terrorists. And more than 16 months later, no one in Washington or Libya has been held accountable. Congress and the American people, and particularly the families of the fallen, deserve the answers that only a joint select committee of Congress could get. And yet, sadly, Mr. President, the majority leader and Democrats in this chamber are blocking a joint select committee. What difference does it make? Former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton said, "It makes all the difference in the world to ascertain the truth." Now, I will note, even though he said not a word about Benghazi in the State of the Union, he was forced to say something this week when he was interviewed by Bill O'Reilly. during the halftime of the Super Bowl, when Bill O'Reilly asked him about Benghazi. What is striking, Mr. President, I would urge everyone to go and watch and listen to what the President said. Bill O'Reilly asked him, did Secretary of Defense Leon Panetta tell him that that night that the attacks were the works of terrorists? Mr. O'Reilly asked that question, and yet the President over and over and over again refused to answer a simple yes or no. Did Leon Panetta tell him it was the act of terrorists? He did not want to answer that question, and indeed, he did not. For those of us that have spent some of our career in a court of law, the technical term for his answer was non-responsive, and were a judge there, he would have directed the President to answer the question that was put to him. Nor did the President say one word about why the talking points were scrubbed to eradicate any mention of terrorism and the Al-Qaeda affiliates involved. Mr. President, we need accountability. We need accountability for those four brave Americans who lost their lives to terrorism. And we need to know why no one has been held accountable in the State Department, nor that any of the terrorists who committed that attack have been brought to justice. And Mr. President, Saeed Abedini, the American pastor brutally imprisoned in Iran. President Obama in the State of the Union address said nothing. The reality is an American citizen has been wrongfully imprisoned in Iran for more than a year simply for professing his Christian faith. All of us are blessed to live in a land where the Constitution guarantees us religious liberty. And yet a Christian pastor going to Iran, professing his faith, was thrown in a pit of a jail. There is no more compelling evidence that the supreme leader in Tehran represents the very same repressive Islamist regime today that he has for so many years, and that his goal is not peaceful rapprochement with the West, but the preservation of his own power. The President of the United States should be standing up and demanding Pastor Saeed Abedini's release, not making his captors into diplomatic partners. Indeed, it is notable in the midst of our negotiations in Geneva, the nation of Iran transferred Pastor Saeed Abedini from one horrible prison to an even worse prison where they keep their death row, where they send people to die. And he did so on the anniversary of Iran's taking Americans hostage, what is referred to in Iran as Death to America Day. Mr. President, that was not accidental. That was meant to thumb their nose at our nation, and the President, instead of standing up for an American wrongfully imprisoned for preaching his Christian faith, the President instead chose in the State of the Union address to say not a word. The President concluded his speech on foreign policy by saying, quote, "Finally, let us remember that our leadership is defined not just by our defense against threats, but by the enormous opportunities to do good and promote understanding around the globe, to forge greater cooperation, to expand new markets, to free people from fear and want. And no one is better in position to take advantage of those opportunities than America." Mr. President, the reality is, if this past week has proven anything, it is that American leadership is not defined by global opportunities to do good and promote understanding. American leadership is defined by defending and promoting the values that have made our nation great. We don't do this by ignoring unpleasant realities, refusing to acknowledge the terrorist attack in Benghazi, sending administration officials out to claim it is not a terrorist attack but the result of an internet video, or refusing to stand for an American wrongfully imprisoned in Iran for preaching his Christian faith. And we don't do this by refusing to admit failure. but by standing up and facing our challenges, accepting responsibility for our actions, and speaking out with a clarion voice for the freedoms we enjoy. Freedoms that should be the aspiration of every man and woman on the planet. Leading from behind does not work. As a result of this administration's misguided foreign policy, the world has become a much more dangerous place in the last 5 years. U.S. national security interests have been endangered dramatically. We see nations like Russia increasing their sphere of influence, while the threats to the security of men and women throughout America grow and multiply. Standing strongly with like-minded allies and encouraging others to seek freedom is not disinterested do-gooding. It is vital work that will promote the security and prosperity of the United States of America, something that I believe is ultimately in the interest of all mankind. I wish when the President of the United States stood on the floor of the House of Representatives to address the nation and address the world, that when he spoke of foreign policy, that he had not embraced a foreign policy fantasy that disregards the cold, hard reality of the dangerous world we live in and the consequences of receding U.S. leadership. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.